Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, April 29th, 2020, and today we're going to be taking a look at the 2020 Senate election in the state of Alabama. Now, the reason why this Senate race is so important is because Doug Jones is an incumbent Democrat in a state like Alabama. I'm going to use Alabama as a point of reference to describe a state as heavily Republican, but it is surprising that Doug Jones did win here 3 years ago. There was a 2017 special election in which it was between Doug Jones and Roy Moore. There was a horrible allegation against Roy Moore that ended up ultimately losing him the campaign. It was a Republican seat. Jeff Sessions retired to become Attorney General, and obviously it was a huge surprise when a Democrat won in a state as solidly Republican as the state of Alabama. In fact, in the United States presidential election in 2016, Donald Trump received 62% of the vote. About 3 in 5 Alabama voters voted for Donald Trump in 2016, and Hillary Clinton got 34%. Now, not saying that this race didn't have interesting things happening that really ultimately ended up being the worst performance for a Republican in modern history in the state of Alabama on a Senate race. But Doug Jones was the first Democrat won since the year, I think, 1992. In fact, the last, or 1990 something, the last Democrat to win in the state of Alabama was reelected as a Republican. So essentially, they're still in. It's Richard Shelby, but the last time, I guess, he won as a Democrat was in the 90s. So the reason why this Senate race also deserves a lot of attention is because it's pretty much an automatic flip, or at least most people think so. Alabama in a presidential election is by no means the same Alabama that it was during a special election immediately after Donald Trump's approval rating drops in every single state. And, you know, it was 2017. There wasn't much to see for the Trump presidency yet. But when you take a look at the approval ratings, he was still above ground in Alabama. But keep in mind, Doug Jones was running against an accused child molester. I mean, putting aside partisan lines, realistically, you don't think that a child molester would even come close to winning a Senate race. Now, obviously, those allegations came out after a lot of early voting had already happened, after a lot of people have already made up their minds, and, you know, Doug Jones didn't necessarily give off the same type of vibe that Donald Trump did or other Republicans that win in Alabama, purely because the base that he's working with is a Republican base. Doug Jones won off of Republican votes that flipped to the Democratic side just for that one election. A lot of Republicans knew that 3 years later they would be voting him out, but Doug Jones doesn't exactly have I guess the worst standing amongst Alabama voters. Currently, based off of polling data, he does do a lot worse than he did in 2017. Based off polling data, he did lead in some of the earlier polls and ended up losing all of the rest of them, but still ended up winning the election. When you look at the polls against Tommy Tuberville, who was a football coach in the state of Alabama, and also Jeff Sessions, who actually held this seat before Doug Jones retired to become Attorney General, got fired by Donald Trump, and now is running for United States Senate. Right now, both of them absolutely decimate Doug Jones. And the reason why this race is competitive on the Republican side is because Jeff Sessions was not necessarily endorsed by Donald Trump. Donald Trump does not necessarily like Jeff Sessions, to put it nicely. And not many Republicans that have not been endorsed by Donald Trump or their opponent was endorsed by Donald Trump have won their primaries. In fact, Jeff Sessions ended up second in a jungle primary against a number of other people. Roy Moore ran for United States Senate again, but obviously he had no realistic shot at this race based off the fact that he lost a previous Senate race to a Democrat. If he had been the nominee, this race would take a lot larger of a turn towards the Democrat than it already has. But when we look at the expected runoff, it looks like it's going to be close. I mean, both of these candidates are obviously going to end up at least probably defeating Doug Jones. This is probably the state that can only be said where it's an absolute Democratic loss and a Republican gain. But, you know, Jeff Sessions could be a stronger candidate against Doug Jones. If the Democrats were to win against a candidate, it would have to be Tommy Tuberville. But Tommy Tuberville seems to be holding off in the polling data against Jeff Sessions. When you look at all of the polls in March, Tommy Tuberville leads all but one in which they tied on. And, you know, Jeff Sessions obviously should be at a much better standing, considering that the fact that he was in the Trump White House. He served as United States Senator here back way before Doug Jones did. And also, if you remember his last election, if you don't remember, you probably wouldn't remember, the last election in which Jeff Sessions was on the ballot, nobody ran against him. They knew this race was not going to be competitive. He was there in 2008, he was there in 2002, he was there in 1996, and he was not there in 1990. So he goes back as the Clinton administration, goes as far back as the Clinton administration, and ended up retiring, and Doug Jones took over, and now it looks like he wants back in the United States Senate. But it's up to Alabama voters whether or not to at least allow him for the chance at winning the nomination, at winning the general election by giving him the nomination. So when you look at the Cook Political Report and pretty much every other polling, not necessarily political machine type company, Cook Political Report, Inside Elections, About a Crystal Ball, the rest of them all consider this race to be either lean or likely Republican. There's no toss-ups in here, and previously we did see these states, some of them at least, some of these companies considered this state a toss-up, but realistically, Alabama is a Republican state. Donald Trump will ride one of those two Republicans and bring them to victory. They will literally survive off his coattails. And if it was any other type of election, sure, the Republicans still most likely would have won, but it wouldn't be as easy because you don't have presidential election turnout, and circumstances in the previous election definitely changed overnight, which they possibly could in this race, but based off the numbers right now, this state is almost certainly going to be a flip. Now, when you look at the money that's raised, though, again, we talk about wasted money by the Democrats and the Republicans all the time. And right now, they're wasting a lot of money on Alabama. $11 million raised for Doug Jones. Now, I get it if these are just solely Alabama contributors, but obviously Doug Jones has to have some major donator. All of them do right now if they're up in the millions, because of the fact that this race is not going to receive too much media attention. It's known as a Republican state with a Democratic senator. That's the only thing off about it. This election doesn't look like it's going to be close. It's not expected to be close based off electoral trends. 2017 was a fluke. And though Doug Jones has $11 million raised and spent $5 million with $8 million in cash on hand, that's not going to change the outcome of this race. Realistically, it is wasted money. Because if you look, sure, in 2018, it was a Democratic wave year. This was a year after Doug Jones won. The Republicans got 59% of the House Representatives vote. That's after the Democrats gained 8% in terms of their vote support. They received 41% after an 8% increase in terms of support from Alabama voters compared to 2016. That's not necessarily the best sign. And Alabama, we know for a fact, will go red in the presidential election. Donald Trump will 100% carry the state of Alabama. Now, the Senate election, the reason why Democrats would love to keep it is because if Doug Jones wins here, he's in till 2026. Okay? Democrats have had Democratic senators from Republican states before. Nebraska, they have one in Montana, they have one in West Virginia, and in terms of Trump states, they have a number of them in Michigan, a number of them in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Wisconsin spread across, 2 in Minnesota, 1 in Colorado, 1 in Arizona, and now that 1 in Alabama. I mean, if you look, the Democrats are holding Senate seats in states that they used to win, at least in presidential elections, or are possibly winning in 2020, but the only 2 outliers, or 3 outliers, are West Virginia, Montana, and Alabama. Montana's election and West Virginia's election happened in 2018, but Alabama's up for grabs this time around. So realistically, it's the only Democratic state in a solid red state that almost absolutely will flip to the GOP. It's crucial that the GOP does carry this state because if we look, Alabama has an election up this time, so let's say that one goes to the Republicans. But let's say the Democrats win in Colorado, and they win in Arizona, and they win in Maine. And then all of a sudden, the map starts narrowing up, and it's 51 to 49 because those 2 independents caucus with the Democrats. And then all of a sudden, it comes into play, well, what about Montana? What if that one goes? Okay, what about North Carolina? What if that one goes? Well, then the Democrats are officially in the majority, and the Republicans, sure, they flip back Alabama, but they didn't realize they were losing Montana. I mean, Montana has a popular governor running. Doug Jones isn't necessarily popular, but he's not necessarily unpopular, but the Democrats definitely should be hedging their bets on a more popular senator than a Democrat who won an election against a accused child molester, and only narrowly. I mean, that election was insanely close, 50% to 48%, had a lot of people on the edge of their seats. I remember I live streamed that event. I did not expect the race to be called that night, and when it was insane that a Democrat had even won in Alabama. I mean, it was just baffling that Doug Jones was able to pull it off. And yes, there were a number of extraneous circumstances that hurt Roy Moore's campaign, but it's still Alabama. It had that reputation of being a solid GOP state time and time again. Okay, whether it's a presidential election, whether it's the House elections in a Democratic wave year, whether it's the previous Senate election with Richard Shelby during a presidential election year, he actually outperformed Donald Trump. Okay, the only type a situation in which Doug Jones does come out on top, or at least close to coming out on top, is if there's a lot of infighting between Tommy Tuberville and Jeff Sessions, and one of them refuses to endorse the other, and then it just goes a little bit south for one of the candidates. Doug Jones touts the fact that he voted with Trump a lot more than a number of other Democrats, and it would honestly help his campaign, but at the same time, there's not much that's going to happen that's going to change the tide of this race. Yes, he has more money, but that's pretty much it. He doesn't have the polling numbers. He doesn't have the practical numbers in terms of party registration support. He doesn't have the predictions. He doesn't have a presidential incumbent to lead him to victory. And there's nothing really that's going to be brought up against Jeff Sessions that wasn't already brought up, or Tommy Tuberville. I mean, it's going to be really hard to go ahead and win this seat as a Democrat just because of the region that it's located in. Doug Jones pulled off an astonishing campaign in 2017, but realistically, I don't think that he's going to even come close in 2020. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you all tomorrow.